Propel really does deserve like a lot of like enthusiasm around their new program. I was fortunate enough to be part of putting together some content for that program, and holy smokes, they have like what they're offering in this accelerator is something that is really next level and awesome for Atlantic Canada. So if you know any companies that are at that stage, like get them in. And now I'm excited to introduce you to Michael Gill. And so Michael's presentation is on growth from zero to many. So Michael Gill is the co-founder and CEO of Peersight, which is an employment marketplace that helps job seekers get to know their potential colleagues before they take the job. And so if you've ever worked with an a-hole, you're probably like, oh man, I needed that. I could have avoided that guy or girl. And before launching Peersight, Michael was the director of performance marketing at CareGuide, which is one of Canada's fastest growing tech companies. He helped to build the team that was responsible for over $7 million in annual paid acquisition spend, and they used SEO to actually close to 3x their organic traffic. And they redesigned their product onboarding, which increased conversion to 20%. So those are numbers that any marketer would be super proud to have. So I'm not sure, there's Michael. Awesome, come on up, Michael. Welcome, Michael.
Do you have the slide answer? How's it going, everyone? Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to spend 45 minutes talking about this amazing moment in a company's life, going from 0 customers or 0 growth to the time when you start to hire people to take this function on. Really exciting time, lots of painful learnings that I've gone through, a lot of my friends are going through, and that hopefully I can save you from going through to the same excruciating degree that we all did. A bit of background, as Caitlin mentioned, I worked at CareGuide as the director of performance marketing, scaled our paid acquisition profitably from $500K a year to $7 million a year. Before that, did a degree in mathematics, and actually was part of the Venture for Canada program. Are there any companies here who've hired Venture for Canada fellows? Yeah, a few good people, right? Good people, yeah. I'm lucky to be a part of them. And now I've launched this second employment marketplace. It's early days yet, but I'm fairly proud of the fact that over the past 4 months, we haven't had a week go by where we aren't growing by 10% week over week. This is one of the graphs from my time at CareGuide. We took on this paid acquisition of job seekers through job syndication. It was a really baby channel when I joined, and I'm really proud to say that Zane, who's running this today, has taken it from me, and it's now upwards of 23x where it started about 2 years ago. Here's growth at Peersight. And because my background is the least exciting part of this presentation, we're going to move on pretty quickly. And we're going to get into a few things that I'm keen to share. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about really common growth mistakes that myself and many others will engage with. Then we'll go to some early organic tactics you can do to acquire your first customers. And then we'll wrap up by talking about what to look for in a growth hire. So early stage mistakes. There's too many of these to put on a slide, but I've chosen 5 that I'm hoping to walk you through that I've seen over and over again. The first is using paid acquisition as one of your first customer channels. The second is A/B testing when you have less than 500 new people landing on a given feature every single day. The third is failing to scale up your data and failing to surface it as well as you could. The fourth is being sure to have less than 3 channels going at any one time until you've got a large team of marketers supporting you. And finally, a really common one that comes with this channel problem is using complicated attribution. So early paid acquisition. Let me tell you a few truths I've learned from my time in paid ac. The first is that you're gonna need to lose money in order to make money. The fact of the matter is, there's other marketers out there competing for your audience's attention who've already spent years of their life and thousands of their dollars learning how to best engage with those people. So paid ac requires that you invest money up front in order to be able to make money into the future. On top of that, you really need to be sure that you're able to align your customer acquisition cost with the LTV of your customers. And finally, the cheapest way to start paid acquisition almost always is to remarket to customers that got this close to buying but then fell off. It's almost always the case in just about every industry. The problem, if you're an early stage company, is that you don't have a lot of money to spend. You often don't have a grasp on the LTV of your customer. Maybe you're trying out multiple pricing plans, as we just discussed. You have a limited number of people to remarket to. And most importantly, by going the paid acquisition route, you're going to learn more slowly. The fact of the matter is, when you introduce new variables, like channel like ad copy, like images, like time of day. All of these things muddy the signals on why customers are saying no to you. And so early on, organic acquisition and also straight up sales are almost certainly a better way to engage with these people so that you can have the tightest feedback loop possible and get your product to somewhere where it's incredibly valuable. The second common theme I've seen is A/B testing with small numbers of users. Now, as growth has become more and more common over the past 6 years, A/B testing as a technique has become pretty mainstream. And the problem here is that if you want to A/B test things, you first need to build an infrastructure. If you aren't doing this today, Google Optimize is a really light way to start A/B testing different parts of your product. But as you get more and more sophisticated, you're going to need engineers to build tooling to allow you to do this at scale. And that takes time, and it's time you're not using to improve your product, make it more desirable, and eventually, hopefully, close more sales. So that's one of the big problems here. The second problem is that you have to do tests using cohort-based analysis. Humans notice change in their environments. So if you're used to looking at a page that has a blue button, I could change that button to purple, and it would look like all of my returning users are all of a sudden clicking this button way more often. But over a course of a couple days or weeks, what you'll notice is that over time, it returns back to baseline. And so you need new users coming in who haven't seen a baseline in order to be able to do A/B testing effectively. And on top of that, you also really need a lot of people. So the time it takes for your tests to reach significance is proportional to 1 over the number of new eyeballs seeing that test every day. What you can see on the screens to your sides are curves showing on the y-axis the time to significance, and on x-axis the number of daily impressions this feature is getting. And so what you can see is that as this number of daily impressions starts to fall below 500, you rapidly asymptote towards infinity. So early A/B testing takes a lot of time, eats up engineering resources, and often is a poor investment until you're getting 500 new folks every day viewing that feature. Now, the next thing we're going to dig into is data. And data is a complicated topic because your data stack could always be better. And the problem startups face is how good should it be? We all sort of understand that the quality of our data really dictates the quality of our decisions. But how much we invest in when is never quite clear. So I'm going to provide a framework that I've seen work for a number of startups in terms of choosing when to implement different data and how to level up their stack accordingly. So the bottom of this pyramid is pixel-based data. This is like Google Analytics, Facebook, that sort of thing. Of people in the room, how many people have Google Analytics on their site? GA? Yeah. Awesome, great. Mixed panel, good for B2B. GA, typically better for business to consumer companies. This should be on your website or app from day one. And what this will allow you to do is some basic analysis around where people are coming from. But the problem is, one, GA doesn't handle unique devices. So if a user is engaging with you on their phone and their laptop, GA won't be able to tie those things together. Two, pixels are fairly flaky. So it could be that a page loads, but your GA pixel doesn't fire. And so when you have less than 50 important things happening on your site in a given day, it's OK to be relying primarily on Google Analytics. But the minute you've crossed that 50 important event threshold, you should really be moving to a queryable database. Now, this almost certainly exists from day one, but the challenge is making it accessible to marketers and growth folks. And also making sure that this database has the necessary infrastructure to allow people to analyze visits. Very few companies out there have a visits table that tracks UTM source, UTM medium, all of these things. And by adding that one table, you're able to allow marketers and growth folks to do everything they could do on GA or elsewhere in your own data. And once you have this data available, I would say you should prioritize making sure every single marketer and growth person in your organization is able to query it. Sounds like a big task if you already have a large number of marketers on your team who can't do this, but there's two huge outcomes that come with a team who can all query data. The first is that you're way faster. You don't have marketers blocked by engineers, and you don't have engineers who need to context switch away from their current project to write a query. The second is that your team just becomes far more connected to the outcomes they're supposed to be producing. If I can look and see how each test I launch, each channel I engage with is driving numbers whenever I want to, I'm going to be far more engaged in that process. And so by giving people the skill to query this data, you more often than not will see that folks are more engaged in the outcomes they're producing. A few quick steps to implement this at your workplace. One, have engineers build a whole bunch of sample queries. Have those live in a space where anyone can access, make them really available. Two, find someone on your marketing team who's pumped to learn this stuff. Call them a subject matter expert, and for a month or two, give them one-on-one coaching with one of the engineers on your team. They should be, kind of setting their own curriculum, progressing through harder and harder queries, this sort of thing. And then once that person has had 4 weeks of coaching, stop having engineers do any of your queries. You should have every marketer try to write the query for themselves, or growth person write the query for themselves. Then have the subject matter expert try with them. Have them go spend some time on Stack Overflow, and once they've done all that, then possibly you can bring in a data scientist or an engineer. But overall, SQL is a really powerful tool. It'll be good for everyone's careers, and it'll keep your team far more aligned if everyone can look at these numbers. Now, the minute you've got this data all accessible, you should help people show it to folks. A relatively simple step, but the idea of having a visualization software. A few quick notes here. Redash is a far too little used open sourced data visualization tool that gives you a whole suite of tools comparable to the best, most expensive paid versions out there. If you're looking for a little bit more support in terms of how to visualize data and do the querying, Chartio will allow you to do a drag and drop feature, and it's one of the less expensive options in the market. And if you're looking to have your team become really exceptional, for example, you have junior data scientists you're hoping to level up in terms of their querying, you can get Periscope, which is incredibly robust and has an awesome customer success team who will coach you to building better queries. Now, if you've got queryable data with a visits table, your team knows how to access it, and you can visualize it, you're in a pretty good spot. You're better than most folks. The problem is you're going to get to a place where you want to start doing really tiny micro-optimizations. You want to understand how a button is clicked, or how much time a user is spending watching a video. The best way to do this is through an events table. This is one really long table that growth marketers or engineers can add to at random. So if one day you decided it was important to track how many people were clicking an arrow in the top left-hand side of your site, you could easily fit that into this events table. Run tests on it, try to optimize for it. So very powerful tool once you've got a growth team up and running. A little bit more laborious in terms of maintenance. It's a very quickly growing table. It typically has unstructured data in it, so it's harder, but this is a great place to get to. And then the final step in this pyramid is alerting. And alerting is very underutilized. It tends to be, once your company has data visualization, you'll see more people love spending time writing queries, visualizing data, doing interesting things. And it can sometimes come at the cost of total output that your growth team is producing. And so alerts are a great way to ensure that your team isn't getting distracted by temporary fluctuations in your data. So for example, in B2C, it's very common for certain days of the week to see a lot of fluctuation, for example, Fridays if it's a long weekend, and marketing might then think that something's broken. Far better than relying on our intuition is to set up a query that's comparing the performance over the past 2 days to those same 2 days last week, trying to understand whether we were below or above some threshold. Typically 15% is a good number to analyze in terms of if the drop is below that. And if you see that, you can ping a channel to get people's attention right away. Great way to avoid, again, spending time on problems that don't exist. On top of this, there's another alert I like to call the Go Faster alert that helps keep your team really aligned on what the most important thing for them to be moving is right now. This doesn't need to run all the time. You can set up queries that will just check this value every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But the goal is to compare where you're trending to where your goal for the entire month. So every Monday, in a public Slack channel, letting people know that you're 5% above your subscriptions or your customer goal, or 5% below. These sorts of things will help keep you focused, and they help every other department that is a step away from this data understand how things are going. It might be, if you're doing really well, engineers feel more comfortable paying down tech debt. Whereas if you're really hurting, you're missing your goal by quite some bit, there's generally a broader agreement that we should push out more marketing or growth-focused related projects. So if you've gotten this far, what's really exciting is you're actually in the top 1% of companies. If you've got event-based tracking and alerting, you're ahead of Yelp, you're ahead of Aldo, you're ahead of almost all startups. So it seems like a lot of stuff, but it's really only a few steps to be really best in class when it comes to data and infrastructure. I'm curious, how many people right here have a marketing or growth team, all of whom can query SQL from their database? Is there a few folks? Not a ton. OK, cool. Well, then some of this stuff will be useful over time. I'm glad. The fourth common problem we run into is seeing people try to spin up a whole bunch of channels at once. There's some common advice in marketing and growth that you need to rapidly test channels. And this is true, but once you've figured out which channel is going to be your most promising way to engage with customers, it's really valuable for you to go deep on that channel and push the others out of your periphery. Most companies that are getting to 10 million in ARR only have 2 sustainable channels. So you don't need to feel like you have to do social and paid AC and SEO and all of these things. A few benefits of going deep on one channel. First, there are going to be things that are true about your market regardless of what channel you use to access users. So at CareGuide, we found that conversion rate was far higher at Monday than any other day of the week. We could have spent a lot of money learning that across multiple channels at the same time, but instead we went deep on search engine marketing and assumed it would be true across our other channels. Now, the way to quickly scale a channel. So the question is, OK, I can't do a lot of channels. How do I make progress if I'm only looking at one of these ways of getting users? And the common mistake I see managers of marketers make is that they will go to their marketing team and say, hey, I need more subscriptions, and I need customer acquisition costs to stay the same or go down, which is totally Sisyphusian. It's incredibly hard, very challenging to optimize for 2 things at once. And so the far better approach is to understand that you're going to need to lose money in order to scale up a channel and figure out things that work. And so I often advise startups on a 1-month cadence, taking the first week of that month and aiming to launch a test that could increase total volume from that channel by about 20%. Do something big, launch in a new province, engage with a different demographic, and then immediately after that first week, cut all of the pieces of that test that are performing worse than 25% of your customer acquisition cost. So if people are just not at all converting in this piece of the country, or no one's engaging with this specific ad, just cut all of that. At that point, you should reduce your customer acquisition cost. You'll see the next week things will improve, but you should also launch a series of tests aimed at reducing your customer acquisition cost further. So your initial threshold was 25% above your target CAC. You're going to launch another series of tests wholly focused on becoming more efficient. Maybe you stop advertising at certain times of day, you trim out other demographics, you change your ad copy. And after the end of those 2 weeks, evaluate each segment of your campaign and try to ensure that your collective customer acquisition cost is setting right around where you want to for your channel. What you'll see here is that growth is not even, but as you're launching these optimizations, your target customer acquisition cost will drop far greater than your subscriptions. And so over time, you'll see that this number goes up and to the right. Now, one caveat here is that no matter what you do, no matter how brilliant you are, your paid channels are going to get more expensive. The fact of the matter is there are a small number of people who are going to love your project. There's a much larger number of people who are going to think your product could be valuable and with the right messaging could buy it. And then there's a fringe group of people outside of that who could be on the edge. And each time you travel outwards in terms of who you're marketing to, it's going to be more and more expensive to get them to engage. So at some point, your target customer acquisition cost is just going to be below where your channel's sitting, and you're going to need to prune back and find other ways to grow. Great. Now, one of the problems that comes up when people are looking at using multiple different channels to engage with users is that they come up with really complicated attribution systems. The first touch is worth 20%, the third touch is worth 10%, but if someone sends a message or does this other thing, it's worth 5%. And I think a lot of the pull here is that we know Airbnb and these other large companies use these attribution systems. But the problem is they're in a totally different world than you are. The fact of the matter is most large companies will talk to their customers in a million different ways. They'll have a bunch of different channels running at once. They'll also spend a lot of money on brand-related advertising, which can be hard to measure, and so requires a lot of finesse in terms of evaluating its impact. Finally, they have to overcome the fact that there's internal teams that are responsible for these different channels and that are being measured accordingly. And so they can't have an attribution system that leaves any one of those teams feeling like it's unfair to them. However, as a startup, you only have 1 to 2 channels. You shouldn't be spending any money on large branding campaigns because you don't get enough data to learn meaningfully from them. And you don't have internal politics or teams to worry about. You should just be thinking about what will help your company be most successful. And so the solution here is to use something dead simple. Whenever you're acquiring customers, just go by first touch. Whatever channel brought this person in to make a user, that's where you attribute it. And on conversion-related channels, so remarketing or email, you can start by using last touch, so how many subscriptions they brought in, as the final touch to that user, how many purchases. But what's more valuable is to look at lift. You probably shouldn't do this until you're seeing a consistent stream of customers, but lift is the idea of creating systems to evaluate the difference in conversion rate when you are or aren't emailing someone. So what you'll do here is you'll run a holdout test where 5% of your users don't get any emails. Kind of scary. Again, early days, you can't risk losing that revenue, but as you're getting bigger, you'll be able to do this. Hold out 5% of people, compare the conversion rate relative to all those folks who did get emails, multiply that delta in conversion rate by the number of users being exposed to this channel, so if it's email, it's everyone, and the LTV of the average customer, and you've got the total dollar amount being added to your business as a result of this channel. Really valuable way to understand in the remarketing world if your ads are worth their dollar spend. And also, this is how you can have an email professional understanding if they're actually getting better at converting users. Often, companies who aren't using this lift-based approach will have trouble distinguishing when SEO or another acquisition channel has grown, differentiating that from when email is actually doing a better job of converting users. Awesome. So those are 5 really common early problems. And now we're going to dig into a few of the tactics you can use to acquire users. So if you're avoiding those problems, what should you do? Well, the first thing to do is to own the fact that no one is looking for you. This seems hard at the beginning, but really it's a competitive advantage because no one is looking for you, and that means that when they discover you, you can set the price of your product, as we've talked about. That's a lot of why investors are willing to make a bet on you. So no one's looking for you, which means you should think about growth not as a way of generating inbound interest a lot of the time in early days. Instead, you should think of growth as a siphon. There's people who could be interested in your product. They live somewhere else. You need to build a system that they can use to be ported over into your world and start engaging with your product. And 3 really common ways I've seen this done. The first is through multi-tenanting. The second is through aggregation. And the third is through communities. Multi-tenanting applies whenever your product is something people could use while also using a competitor's solution. So if you're a company who sells ad space for people who are looking to promote their used car, if you're trying to help people sell their used car, it could be that they're also using Kijiji, and they're also using Craigslist, and a number of other solutions. And so what you can do is start using these solutions as well, posing as the other side of the marketplace, reaching out to people who you think could use your solution through your competitors, and driving them to use your product. Seems incredibly manual, but early days, this is a great way to get your first few people on your platform. And if it starts to prove scalable, you can then outsource this, hire other folks to do this at a relatively low rate, and start to automate it. On top of this, there's another tactic you can engage in called honeypotting. And honeypotting is the idea that if you post content from your users on these other sites, people will start to engage with it, and then you can, at that point, when they've proven their interest, you can direct them over to your own product. Really valuable because it's much harder for Kijiji to detect when you're honeypotting or Craigslist to detect when you're honeypotting than it is when you're doing direct outreach. So these are some of the early tactics you can engage in. Airbnb did this stuff, and really it's going to feel painful at the start, but again, that's what it feels like to be learning. If you were just running ads, you wouldn't be having customers reject you. You wouldn't have any insight into why they were saying no. The next step is aggregation. And so this is the idea that it might be the case that your target customer has a problem where the solution is hard to find. Okay? So they want to find a housekeeper, and they can't find a list of housekeepers to contact. Aggregation is all about the idea that you can do the work for them of collecting all of this information, bringing it on to a platform you own, and start solving their problem that way, even if you don't have the solution in-house yourself. Two ways this can manifest in real life. One is the example of Udemy. So Udemy is a marketplace for courses. And the way they started is they just took all the online courses from MIT, from Harvard, from Stanford, and they made them easily searchable on their own platform. Really helpful to users, didn't require that they had tons of people creating content. Beyond that, though, if you aren't directly a marketplace, you can think about tangential problems that you can solve for users just by collecting what's already out there. So for example, if you are in the employment space, people might be looking for jobs. Those same people also might be curious about good questions to ask in their interview. And so one thing you could do is make a short little tool that, based on their discipline and based on their years of experience, suggests great questions to ask in their interview of their employer, and market that as a separate usable tool. Really valuable thing about this approach is what you've just done is created a feature that you can launch on Product Hunt. You can launch it in Reddit groups, you can talk about it on Quora, and all of these things can generate interest for your company in an inbound way. So this is a tactic that a lot of small companies who are struggling to get SEO, who are struggling to get other organic acquisition, can just pour their hard work into creating something usable and generating leads. Now the last topic is communities. So this applies to just about everyone, because there should be some group of people who really acutely feel the pain that you're trying to solve. They should exist somewhere, and they typically are either professional in nature, maybe they work a certain kind of job or at a certain kind of company, or they have some sort of connecting personal attributes. So if you can identify who these people are, the question is then, how do you get in front of them? And so if you join a bunch of LinkedIn groups, you can message these people yourself, but what's far more exciting is that there's a suite of tools just built to help folks like you get in front of these individuals. So Phantom Buster is this awesome website. You don't have to write any code, and it will allow you to pull down every single LinkedIn profile from these groups of folks who've expressed interest in the problem you're solving. At that point, you can use a tool called Linked Me Helper to automate your connections to these individuals and follow up with them as soon as they accept. You can use a tool called Contact Out to find their emails, and you can set them up in email drips. And again, this might not feel like you're doing marketing or you're doing growth, but when you don't have a ton of customers, this is how you're going to learn the most, by talking to them and have them rejecting you in a way you can document and feed into your product process. Similarly, there's another set of tools you can use to do this exact same thing for Facebook groups. So Phantom Buster, again, great set of APIs, pull down people's Facebook information, tie that information to their LinkedIn account, and run through the same process all over again. Interesting things about these set of automation tools, LinkedIn's really smart. So you're going to have to be careful watching how many people you're scraping, watching how many messages and connections you're sending. But over time, you'll be able to increase this limit in a way that actually, for a lot of companies, lets them leverage LinkedIn organically as their largest channel for users. So if you can't multi-tenant and you can't aggregate, you definitely can find communities who you want to reach out to and get that feedback from them. So hiring, you've started with this siphon-based approach to growth. You've built some data infrastructure. You've got an organic channel starting to hum. And the question then is, should I hire someone to take this on? And that initial question of whether or not to hire is going to be highly personal to each company. And I guess the way you should frame it is, do I need someone else to step in and fill this role? Is it necessary? And really, you should be running as lean as possible. The second question, though, that not enough companies spend time considering is whether you should outsource this work or hire someone full-time. There tends to be a set of companies who do almost all of their work in-house, and then another set of companies who outsource almost everything. And as a result, you're probably going to be a part of a culture that has a bias to one of these others. And so taking time to pause and reflect on whether you really need an in-house person or an outsourced source of support can help save you a lot of money and ensure your organization is operating optimally. In the past, I've asked myself 3 questions to evaluate whether I need to hire someone in-house. The first question is, can this channel 3x? If I can't see this function or this specific channel growing by 3x, it's probably not worth my time to transfer everything I've learned about it into someone else's head and then have them develop a set of expertise around this channel in a full-time based manner. Far better is to try and push ahead, get some more wins myself, and then outsource it. A fact about outsourcing, you can count on it to be really good at maintaining things and operating on fixed processes, fixed systems. It tends to be very hard for outsourced support to be effective at taking your company or taking your channel to the next level. Awesome. Okay, so then the next question I ask, if I've decided that this function could 3x, is the growth of this function, the continued growth of this function, necessary to my success as a business? And if it's not, it means that there's some other part of your business who would be better served by these resources. So really questioning, do I need to improve here to survive? And if I don't, I should save the money for when things go wrong or for some other piece of the business that's going to benefit from those resources. Now, the third question I ask is all about the idea of differences. So is it possible for this function to be a major competitive advantage relative to all the incumbents in the space? And really, the answer doesn't ever need to be no. This is more a prompt for the manager. And the question they should be engaging with is, how can I set this potential hire up in a way that they could help our business take a step function? How could the thing they build really set us apart? And in doing so, you're almost certainly going to craft a far more meaningful career path for this eventual hire than had you thought about this function only as something that needs to exist sort of on the fridge or needs to just be present so that you're matching what your competitors offer. Questions you shouldn't worry about, there's 2 of them. One of them that's really common is this too hard for an outsourcer? And the answer here is that there's no such thing. If you do your job as someone who's overseeing this process of breaking it down into smaller components, you can find a way to do it at a low cost. And there's freelance support available at every skill level imaginable. So it's not a question of whether something is too hard. It's a question of whether this is what your business needs right now. Similarly, another thing I've heard is that there's not enough talent in the space right now. There's not enough talent to go and hire someone for this role, so we're going to outsource it. The problem there is you probably won't reevaluate that decision in the near term. And you probably haven't taken the time to consider what it would look like to build that talent. I've talked a little bit about VFC, but there's a ton of recent grads, people with limited experience, or people looking to change disciplines to a new area who are incredibly excited to learn and who could get to the level of most intermediate professionals in a given degree if you were able to connect them with the right mentors. So this is something I don't think enough managers really lean into, that one of their major roles, especially if you are the CEO, one of the major things you can do for your company is proactively seek out mentors at every single turn. People will say yes to you who won't say yes to the other folks in your organization. So leveraging your title and your investors' network and your friends' networks to find mentors for your people is incredibly, incredibly underutilized. And so at the point you've decided you're going to hire someone, the next thing to question is, what should I look for? What makes a good growth person? Almost everyone in growth or marketing is highly analytical. They're comfortable evaluating their success through numbers, and they're also often very curious. With marketing in particular, it's a zero-sum game. As we talked about, you're effectively competing against every other marketer out there for attention and engagement, which means there's far less helpful resources than there are in engineering, where it's not a zero-sum game. Everyone can build a beautiful functional product. You're not at all competing. And so as a result, you need people who are going to go out and teach themselves things, often just by observing what all your competitors are doing. Finally, these folks should almost certainly be outcome-oriented. If they aren't excited about hitting goals, if they aren't excited about moving numbers, they're not going to want to go out and send the 200 Kijiji messages that are necessary to understand if this is a potential channel for you. So looking for folks who are outcome-oriented and asking about how they set goals in their personal life is a really valuable way to understand if someone's going to be a fit for this. Thinking more specifically, I've observed two kind of personas that tend to thrive in a growth environment, in a growth role, and they tend to gravitate to different stages of the company's life cycle. The first is the hacker. And this is someone who takes a whole lot of pleasure in bending the rules. They like looking for loopholes. They're trying to beat systems very often. They typically are highly creative. They produce a ton of ideas, and they work really fast. The flip side of this is that they're often not the most attentive to detail. And I think whenever you're hiring for a given role, you should be leaning into what are the one or two qualities that are going to make someone really exceptional, and almost not evaluating them on all the others. So it's okay if this person isn't the most attentive to detail. I think just asking people straight up front whether or not they're comfortable bending the rules, whether they have hacked in-person systems, is a great way to evaluate this personality type. The second persona is the analyst. And this is someone who gets pumped up about numbers. They can slice and dice all day. They love tests. They're often very systematic. So this is someone who will build a process and follow it to the T because they know that it could skew their numbers if they aren't building a robust testing environment, for example, or they aren't, operating to a certain degree of significance on all of their tests. So they're typically very systematic, and they also often love efficiency. And my favorite way of evaluating this persona is to ask, again, people about their personal life and what systems they've built. So for example, I have friends who've tested all different sorts of lengths of sleep. And they've tried different tools. Some of them use earplugs, others use masks. This one friend in particular has determined that the best way for him to sleep is with earplugs and a mask for just 6 hours a night, though, because he doesn't get any benefit from those added 2 hours. And so that sort of efficiency and testing and optimization in your personal life is going to translate almost certainly into a really awesome analyst in the workplace. And so some final notes here. One of the challenges of hiring and managing a marketing team, moving away from growth, is that each channel requires a really different personality. Starting with email. Email is the only channel where your screw-ups are seen by every single one of your customers, potentially every week in that newsletter you send out. So for email in particular, optimizing for a really high attention to detail is incredibly, incredibly valuable. On top of this, some other skill sets I've seen make great email marketers are an interest in consumer psychology or behavioral economics. If this person gets excited about framing things in a certain way to nudge a customer or elicit some action, they're probably going to be a killer email marketer. On the flip side, paid acquisition almost doesn't need to consider your end user. Paid acquisition just has to be really pumped about analyzing data and is comfortable living in spreadsheets or SQL for a large part of their day. Again, there's a lot of people who are excited by doing number crunching once in a while, but the questions you should be asking when you're interviewing paid acquisition people is whether they're comfortable doing this analysis for 80% of their day, because it's going to be what leads to most of their step function wins. Technical SEO, this interesting role of having people who can code to make changes to your website to optimize things for Google. Funny role to fill in that they're going to sit probably somewhere between engineering and marketing, maybe on your growth team. But unlike most marketers and growth folks, they need to be super patient. They need to be really committed to systems, and they need to be comfortable with the fact that their efforts today aren't necessarily going to yield any fruit for the next 6 weeks. So this technical SEO role is an interesting one to place, but yeah, patience, persistence, and an adherence to system are incredibly valuable. Content, if you're a B2B company and you think content will be a really meaningful role for you, something people I don't think appreciate about content is that to do this well means you are probably the hardest working person in your organization. You have to be constantly looking at what your competitors are doing, writing long form pieces of insightful content for people, and then what a lot of people fail to do effectively is reaching out to a ton of different places to get your content placed and asking for backlinks. So for content to be really effective, you need to be going beyond just writing the stuff. Distribution is 50% of the work. Getting backlinks is another 20% of the work. And it's all stuff that can be somewhat unglamorous. And so getting someone who's really excited to put in the hours is really valuable here and something that people don't talk enough about when it comes to hiring someone to do content. And then on a final note, brand. And my advice here is not to hire someone to do brand until you have a Series A. It's hard to measure, and again, you want to be optimizing for learning. So using these direct channels where you get quicker feedback, where you can talk to customers, is almost certainly a better use of your time and energy. So with that, thank you so much. It's been a ton of fun talking to you. I'm glad we could dig into data a little bit, glad we could talk a little bit about some early growth tactics, and finally get into what I typically look for in growth hires. Happy to have you reach out to me over email, but I'd also love to field some of your questions now. Thanks. Any questions? Cool. Thanks, y'all.
Fantastic. Great job. I don't know what you guys, but I'm like incredibly impressed right now. This just goes to show how great that program Venture for Canada is. So if anybody has an opportunity to hire any of those grads, if you want a Michael on your team, like make sure that you take advantage of that. And I also love that you talked about aggregation as a channel and this idea of like building your own products. I really think that as content marketing becomes more and more competitive, sales becomes harder to scale, people don't want to be sold to, that the kind of like growth of what you call the PQL or the product qualified lead is going to be really valuable, and more companies are going to be creating these little mini products and actually giving those away as a way to generate leads. So that's pretty cool. So we have a 15-minute break now, and then when you come back, you're going to get to hear from our last speaker, and we're really excited to hear from Ava. And then you're going to see a panel with all the speakers today, and you're going to be able to ask them your questions. So we'll see you guys shortly.